Now I present to you Kim Gallagher.
My name is Kim Gallagher. I'm a docent here at Morven, and I take great pleasure in welcoming you to our first Morven moment. Today is February 22nd, the birthday of George Washington. In fact, this would be his 289th birthday.
So there will be a quiz at the end. Which birthday is it? Moving on. So we entitled this segment "A Friendship for the Ages." Annis Boudinot Stockton, one of America's first female published poets, wife of Richard Stockton, one of New Jersey's 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence. And George Washington, we all know him, America's first president, friend to Annis, and Morven visitor. So the big question for today is, what was the attraction for this friendship to endure through Washington's presidency? And a lot of that is illuminated in Annis's book and in Washington's letters. So here we go. We are in the dining room, and it's happy 289th birthday, George Washington.
The reason that we're interested in George Washington and Morven, there's lots of reasons to be interested in George Washington, of course, but in terms of Morven, there's something particularly interesting, and that's the relationship between George Washington and Annis Boudinot Stockton, who was the wife of Richard Stockton, the signer of the Declaration of Independence. But today we're going to concentrate on Annis, the charming, witty, articulate poet that was a good friend of George Washington's. In fact, they established a correspondence. We don't know precisely when it started nor when it precisely ended, but we do know and have some of the letters in which she sent poems to George Washington, and he in turn responded to those letters with slightly flirtatious, kind of pleasantly flirtatious letters of his own. The first time they met, and we think the correspondence started, was in 1781. At the end of August, August 31st and September 1st, George Washington was here with part of his army and the French army, commanded by General Rochambeau, when they were on their way from New York and Rhode Island down to Virginia in order to attack Yorktown and end the revolution. At that time, the tradition has it, and there is some evidence, that in fact Rochambeau and Washington had dinner here with Annis. Now, in the late summer of 1781, Annis was a widow. Richard had died 6 months earlier on February 28th, 1781. And the British had occupied Princeton, so there was a lot of rebuilding going on. The financial situation for a lot of the people here, including for the Stocktons, was pretty tough. But when the armies came through and Washington and Rochambeau visited, we think that's when this correspondence and friendship between Annis and George began. Stop.
So here he is. Here's George Washington after the Battle of Princeton, 1779 to 1782 by Charles Wilson Peel. So it's pretty attractive there. Looks pretty good.
Yeah, this can I say a word, Debbie?
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is the actually first of 6 versions of this particular portrait. And it's the first one, the 1779 one, that has the most expressive look of George Washington in any of all the portraits that he had made, including statuary. So this is the George Washington that Annis saw at the end of August 1781.
Pretty handsome dude. And here's Annis, also looking pretty good. What do you think, Kim?
Yeah, she when they met in 1781. Of course, she had been a widow for about 6 months, and had been a pretty terrible disease from 78 to 81 that Richard Stockton went through. So she was at this point about 45, but all the contemporary accounts say that she was vivacious, lovely, charming. She wrote some of her best poetry in the next few years. I think it's a little bit easier for us in the 21st century to understand why George was attracted to Annis than the other way around.
So now the questions become exactly how many times did George Washington visit Morven? 1783, he returns to Morven. Why? And was George Washington the only president of the United States to dine at Morven in the 18th century? Ooh, Kim, let us know what happens.
So the next time that George Washington was here that we know about for sure was in 1783, close to the end of the war. And the reason George Washington was here is because he was invited by this fellow, Elias Boudinot IV, who was the younger brother of Annis. At the time, Elias Boudinot IV was the president of the United States. Under the Articles of Confederation, which was how the government was operating during and immediately after the American Revolution, the Articles of Confederation were the rules. That was the equivalent of the Constitution, which of course the Constitution we have now dates from 1787, 88, 89. But whoever was the head of Congress had been elected by Congress to be its head. That person was, in effect, president of the United States. Now, the only government we had in those times was the Congress. And wherever the Congress sat, that was the capital. And from June to November 1783, the Congress, which had been driven out of Philadelphia by rioting soldiers, met here in Princeton, where Elias, in fact, had grown up. The American Revolution was in the process of ending. In 1782, the British had started parliamentary things to get surrender negotiations, or treaty, not surrender, treaty negotiations underway. And so by the time we get to 1783, there's a lot of decisions that have to be made. The first decision, of course, is what to do with the army now that the war was ending. And that's why George Washington was summoned by Elias and Congress to Princeton. And he was here in Princeton from August 23rd, 1783 to November 9th, 1783. And when he was here, he was able to visit his friend Annis. And we know for a fact that the correspondence continued beyond that point, probably to 1790. Okay, so what was the attraction between Annis and George? It's pretty easy to understand why George Washington was attracted to Annis, because lots of people were attracted to Annis. She was witty, she was articulate, she was a published poet. She became known as, literally, as the Muse of Morven. And the correspondence that Annis sent to George Washington was largely composed of poems, describing what a wonderful guy George was. So it's easy to see why Annis was someone that would be attractive to George Washington and many others, actually. Now, as I mentioned earlier, she was widowed in 1781. So part of the myth and legend of George and Annis is that they were more than simply correspondents. That there is absolutely no evidence to bear out that they were more than that. Now, in terms of attraction, it's a little more difficult for us in the 21st century to understand why Annis was necessarily attracted to George Washington, because today, most of us have this picture of George Washington in our heads. This is a print based on a 1795 Gilbert Stuart unfinished portrait. And it's been on the good old American $1 bill since 1869. Now, this is a picture, though, of a person who was in his 60s. I mean, think of the picture. The white hair, the kind of, the face that has sort of a blank expression. It isn't lively. It isn't at all charismatic. But in the 1770s and 1780s, George Washington was in his 40s. He was at the peak of his strength. He was one of the best horsemen, maybe the best horseman in North America. I mean, he was charismatic and heroic, physically heroic, as well as they would say in those days, morally heroic. True, there's lots of things that we would wish George hadn't been, such as a slave owner. But at the time he was here in 1781 and in 1783 and some other times that we'll mention, I mean, this was the kind of guy who attracted attention, that he had charisma that worked, maybe not in the 21st century, but it certainly worked in the 18th century. And it certainly worked with Alice. And that's one of the reasons they became friends. When George Washington was first here, we think with starting the correspondence in 1781, everyone knew that the stakes were pretty high, that the French and the Americans were going for the final confrontation. They didn't know for sure it was the final confrontation, but wanted it to be down in Virginia at Yorktown. So, I mean, the kind of strength, the energy, the fact that Washington had held the army together since 1775. He'd lost more battles than he'd won, but the army and the cause endured. And that is the kind of thing that influenced how people thought about George Washington. Now, what other times might George have been here besides 1781 and 1783? Well, we're pretty sure that he may have passed through in 1775 when he was going, this would be June of 1775, after the Congress had made him commander of the Continental Army, and he passed from Philadelphia up to Boston. Once again in 1776, we know, it's actually documented that he was here on May 22nd, 1776, and stayed at the Hudibras Tavern, which used to be next to the college, when he had been summoned by Congress to talk about the disastrous invasion of Canada and how he was going to defend New York, because the British, everyone knew, were coming and to try and reconquer America. And he was probably here in June of 1776 on the way back to New York City. Now, the British did attack from Staten Island to Brooklyn and literally drove for 4 months at the end of 1776. We're driving the Americans out of New York, out of Rhode Island, and across New Jersey. On December 2nd and to December 7th or so, the Americans were in Princeton. The British were only 10 miles away in New Brunswick, and Washington was here at that time as well. We know that Annis and her family were not here. They had evacuated on November 29, 1776. Now, if my camera person will follow me, there is a particularly important time, another time when George Washington was here. And that was January 3rd, 1777, when Washington notably defeated the British here in Princeton. And as the exciting conclusion to what's been called the 10 Crucial Days, that really rebooted, turned around the momentum of the war. Was he here in 1778 during the Monmouth campaign? We know he would move from Valley Forge all the way to Freehold. We don't think he made it here. We know he was in Rocky Hill and Kingston, but that's all. So the next time would be the meeting in 1781, when Washington was here with Rush and Wolfe. So 1781, 1783, meeting Congress. There's a couple more times when we think he was here and most certainly interacted with Annis. One was in 1789, when Washington, who had been elected the first president of the United States, passed through Trenton and then through Princeton on the way to New York for the inauguration. The following year, when the capital was moving from New York to Philadelphia, Washington and Martha both passed through Trenton. We don't know if Washington had a chance to meet with Annis, but the history is fairly solid that Martha actually visited Annis here at Morven. According to the records, Washington met with local dignitaries at a local tavern. So with that, we wish George Washington again a happy 289th birthday, and we hope that you'll come to Morven to learn more about Annis and George Washington.
And oh, if haply in native shade, one thought of Jersey enters your mind, forget not her on Morven's humble glade, who feels for you a friendship most refined. An ode from Annis to George, August 26, 1783. And now we get to the fun part. Oop, I'm going to stop sharing. If I can stop sharing. Oop, it should be stopped now.
Well, there's some familiar looking names there, I see.
Oop, do you see people? There we go. Hi. Okay.
Hey, Liza.
So we have some questions in the chat. When did George marry Martha? Oh, do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, he was in the Army of the state of Virginia from 1754 to 1758. And it was after he stopped being the colonel of the 1st Virginia Regiment that he and Martha got together. And I'm pretty sure that they were married in 1759.
Actually, you know what? One of our other docents, Barbara Beckley, popped on and she put in the chat January 6, 1759. So she's been Googling, I think, Ken.
Good for you. Thanks.
And so Christopher Carpenter said, so George and Annis are only attracted to each other. That's in quotes in the chat. So yeah, would we say?
Yeah, there's been stories, particularly in Princeton, for I'm sure for the last 200 years, that they were more than just correspondents and more than just friends. But there isn't any solid evidence that they were more than that. You put a few lines of Annis's poetry up, and one of the kind of, yeah, and that's a particularly good book by Carla Mulford from Penn State, who is the world's expert on Annis's poetry and life. But Washington himself was not a real avid poetry person. People were writing poems about how wonderful he was all the time throughout his career. But the kind of things that he read were generally history books or books on the latest agricultural craze that he could use at Mount Vernon. And he liked conventional 18th century theater, such as Joseph Addison's really stultifying play called Cato. But the advantage that Annis's poems had in getting his attention was, admittedly, Annis.
So do we know what their very first meeting was? Like, do we have any documentation of the very first time?
What we do know is that after the battles in Trenton and Princeton, so sometime in 1777 or 78, she wrote a poem to Washington. And in fact, it was a poem that was later published, but not till the 1780s. We think that the poem got to George Washington, not directly from Annis, but through her brother, Elias. Now, in those times when he was passing through Princeton, he obviously knew her husband, Judge Stockton, from various things, including Congress. Would they have met? Possibly, but the only documented time we have is at the end of August 1781, when Washington was there with Rochambeau. And the dates on that tend to fly around depending on which reference, which book you concentrate on. Carla, for example, says it was August 29th, 1781. Some others say August 30th, that sort of thing. Basically, it was the end of August 1781. That's the one time we know for sure that Annis and George met.
Now, do we know of any gifts that he actually brought? Because there's been a lot of surmising about gifts that Washington gave.
That I'm unfamiliar with. I don't know.
Okay, I thought you were. Do we have any other questions for our Morven moment?
Well, just going back to the gift question, our friend Helen Hamilton Shields Stockton was famous for attributing all sorts of things to be gifts from George and Martha Washington to Annis and Richard Stockton that we have absolutely no proof of. So there are pieces in the collection that people will say, oh, wasn't that a gift of? And like the tall chest of drawers being one of them, that would be a really unusual gift for somebody to give a friend. So there are rumors of things that were gifts, but there are none that are proven.
Right, is another myth being busted by our executive director, Jill Barry.
Yeah, a question that someone could ask, but hasn't just yet, is how many poems are we talking about went from Annis to George?
Wow.
And in fact, there were 9 poems, 10 depending on how you count them, because a fragment, the end of one poem was published separately from the rest of it. So the first poem was this one that was written in 77 or 78 and delivered to Washington via Elias in 1779. And the last poem that we're aware of was in fact probably written and sent to George Washington right about this time of year in 1790, because it was a birthday ode to George Washington.
Do you think they had cherry pie?
No cherry pie. No. Most of the poems, for me, to tell you the truth, reading Annis's poems is kind of difficult because they're very 18th century. They're full of sylvan glades, and the muses are doing this, and there's gods and goddesses and beautiful places on the slopes of Mount Olympus, all of which, of course, are neoclassical symbols that were, part of doing poetry in the 18th century. And poetry was the key, most important literary genre of that period. And when they would, the way the literary circles would get the most out of the poems is they would actually perform the poems for each other. And I say perform, not simply read, because that's how the different authors, such as Annis or her friend Elizabeth Graham Ferguson in Philadelphia, would really convey what they were trying to convey in these poems. It's quite difficult to simply read out loud one of Annis's poems and be able to do that. But if you think about Amanda Gorman at the inauguration on January 20th, that was a performance of a poem. Good words, but the right pacing, pausing, gestures. You can see the face, the shine of the eyes as the poet is presenting it. That's what these people, Annis and her friends in the literary circles in Princeton and Philadelphia, that's what they would have been trying to accomplish as much as they could.
And I'm not going to read it to you, but in the book, which you can get from our museum shop and you can order online to sit home and read, there are snow poems. I'm not going to read a snow poem today.
How appropriate.
She did. She wrote a lot about nature, a lot about her world, and a lot of how she wrote was kind of the way we're all living right now, where she was, she didn't travel a great far afield in her life, right? So she wrote about what she knew and her world around her. So,
but the the other type of poem, and there were all kinds of different forms, odes and pastorals and so forth. And she wrote in all of the different forms that existed at the time. But the poems that went to George Washington tended to be about public affairs and George Washington's role in those public affairs. The two longest poems, for example, that are pastoral allegories, they're over 200 lines long, were almost a recitation of history up to the time that the poem was written. So she was capable of dealing with civic affairs, public affairs, and history in her poems also. Besides us, who else was living at Morven in 1783? Did you catch that?
No, it just popped up. Besides Annis, who else was living at Morven in 1783?
Well, there would have been the family that was 6 children. Oh no, there would have been 5 children there because Julia had gotten, the eldest, had gotten married in 1776 to Benjamin Rush. So I think there were 5 children. Elias probably spent a lot of his time when he was her brother when Congress was there at Morven, and of course Morven was part of a large network of lands owned by the Stocktons, so there would have been lots of servants, people working on the farms. And the reality is that the Stocktons had enslaved people working for them as well. So it would have been a crowded house because, there's Annis, there's the children, there's people associated with the family going in and out. And then, and when Congress was there, Elias, the president of Congress, was there, and people like George Washington and James Madison, Thomas Paine, possibly John Paul Jones, who was looking for a job. All of those people would have been visiting, and they would have come probably to Morven in order to socialize with Elias and probably with Annis as well.
So now, Kim, in 1783, how different would the house have looked than it does now?
That's very difficult to say because the house was really transformed later in the 1780s when the East Wing was added. And then in the 1790s, there were quite dramatic changes to the central block as well, where the ceilings were raised. And this was by the next generation of Stocktons who lived in the house. So, the house would have been similar. We surmise, we speculate, but it was fairly drastically changed, enlarged, in particular in the late 1780s and in the mid 1790s by Annis's son, Richard. They called him, his nickname was Dickie, but he was born as John Richard, but he became Richard Stockton. There's a zillion Richard Stocktons, by the way.
You don't want to give away too much about the Duke because Richard.
Oh, that's the next one. Yeah, I forgot about
that. More moment, so you don't want to.
Okay, never mind. Ignore the last 2 minutes.
Do we have any other questions for today about Annis, George, Morven? And as I mentioned, this Morven Moments, we hope to be doing these every couple of weeks. And our next one is scheduled. And as they say, in the can, it's ready. So, a preview of coming attractions. Oh, so preview of coming attractions someone is asking for. So our next Morven moment is Richard the Duke.
So Richard the Duke is the second generation of Stocktons. Richard the Duke was the firstborn son, the 4th child who made it to adulthood of Richard and Annis. And we'll talk about why he was called the Duke. And it could be related to the fact that in the 1780s, in 1783 in particular, when Annis was known as the Muse of Morven, she was also being identified as the Duchess of Morven by some people. So that, who knows, maybe that contributed to her son being called the Duke.
Interesting point. And we're also following that going to talk about also with Richard the Duke, the enslaved at Morven.
Yeah, isn't that the third one?
That's the third Morven moment. So we've got a lot of things coming up, and we traveled through history with our Morven moments, and we started in a good spot. I hope you all enjoyed today. If there are any other questions, we have a few more moments because this is our lunchtime little snack through history.
Yeah, this is kind of fun, actually. So
I hope you all had fun today. Thank you, Kim Gallagher, so much. Kim has been a wonderful docent and supporter of Morven for quite a number of years, and we really are so fortunate to have him. And we look forward to seeing you all with us again. So happy lunchtime, everyone. And we hope you enjoyed your Morven moment. You will get a recording of today so you can breeze through at your leisure. So thank you.
and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.